Okay, let's see if this is live now with a bit of luck. Now, YouTube is saying something about connection quality, so hopefully this will work okay, but you'll have to let me know. So, yeah, welcome. Can everybody hear me okay, first of all? Does this, hopefully this is all working. Like I said, YouTube is saying that the quality is pretty bad. So, oh no, it's saying it's good now. Hopefully it should last okay. "100% okay." Rita, good evening, Rita. Thank you for joining me. Darren Corrine, thanks for the vids. Well, you're very welcome. I'm hoping that everybody can take something away from this. Got a bit of a losing my voice a little bit here after the last show. I was having quite a bit of trouble with my voice, so hence the medicinal wine, of course. So, but yeah. Right, okay, let's just see how many people have we got here, and I'll see if we start going. Okay, I'll give it a minute for a few more people, see if there's a few more people turn up. Yes, Tom, red wine was beer last time, but I think red wine might work a little bit better with the throat, hopefully. XRP Winebot. Now that's a good idea. I did think about actually doing a, a beer IOU system based on the XRP ledger. You know, who owes who a beer, and rather than actually tipping XRP, you could tip somebody a beer, and then at some point in time you could redeem beers. I thought that'd be quite a good system. Okay, well, let's get started then. So, Cryptocurrency Explained, episode 3. We're going to be talking about what do we mean by centralized or decentralized. Probably one of the hottest topics, most debated topics in cryptocurrency. Can get very heated. Anybody who's been on any arguments on Twitter, I normally wade into them quite a lot. And so, yeah, it's a topic that is debated a lot. Now, there's a lot of misinformation about especially regarding XRP, the XRP ledger, and a lot of people misunderstand how it works. But I'm going to be talking in general as well. And there's a lot of tidbits from here that I'm going to take from various things that, for instance, people like David Schwartz have said, who've got a very philosophical way of looking about centralization and decentralization. So we're going to, hopefully draw upon some of them to talk about this. So the idea being, hopefully, the end of this talk to have a bit of a better idea about what people mean when they say centralized or decentralized. So, first of all, let's have a quick look here. Centralization or decentralization. One of the biggest issues with the topic itself is that the word itself can be applied to various different areas. Now, I've picked out 4 different areas here. There's possibly more, but these are the 4 different ones that I've kind of come up with in terms of how you can measure, which areas you can apply the term centralization or decentralization to. Now, centralization is not a absolute thing. It's not a 1 or a 0. There's a scale. Certain things can be more centralized, can be less centralized, and things can change over time as well. So when somebody says, is something centralized or is something decentralized, often thinking about it in such absolute terms might not be helpful. But hopefully we can frame this in terms of what people actually mean by that, or what the threat models are with regards to centralization or decentralization. So I've listed 4 areas here. Network, as in the technical network and the architecture of the cryptocurrency. Governance, so talking about the people, the leadership, how decisions are made, how things are progressed, promoted, etc. Code base, so looking at the code behind the network, who owns it, how is it run, who can make changes to it. And economics, talking about who holds the currency, what they can do with the currency, that sort of thing. So we'll kind of touch upon these four areas. Unlike last time, I haven't got many slides. I've just got this one slide actually, and we're going to talk about this, but I've got a number of sort of tabs in the browser that we'll go through. So just stepping back a bit, and let's set the scene a little bit here. So 2010, 8 years ago, I ran a conference here in Bristol for an open source content management system called Plone. Plone is the kind of thing that is used in large organizations to manage the content of a website. It's used a lot for intranets and portals and things like that. It's developed by a community around the world, and I helped organise and host here in Bristol the conference in 2010 and also in 2014, but I'm talking about the 2010 one here. Now this conference there was about 300 people at this conference from 30 different countries. It was spread over 7 days. 3 days were actual talks, 2 days were trainings, 2 days were development sprints afterwards. And we had people come from all over the place coming to this conference, traveling from all over the world. We had 4 parallel tracks running in 4 different rooms. So it was quite a big event, and held in a big hotel here in Bristol. I had to organise the hotel and the catering and all the things kind of ancillary to running a conference. One of the things we had to do was to take payment for the tickets. I can't remember exactly how much the tickets were, but they were, for conference terms, fairly cheap. They were maybe a few €100, something like that, 300, 400 euros maybe, that sort of order of magnitude. But we had 300 people coming, so we had a fair amount of money coming in. And we were selling the tickets online on the website, and we were taking payment via PayPal. And that was great because, like I said, people from 30 different countries. It was probably one of the most well-known, well-used systems. We're going back 8 years ago, remember, for payment. One of the first systems for payment online. And all was going very well. The payments were coming in. And we must have had something like, I think, about £70,000 in the account just before we were about to start booking things in, and suddenly PayPal seized the funds. They ring-fenced the funds. We could no longer withdraw from them. £70,000 locked up. Nothing we could do. We had a venue to pay for, as you can see from the photos. It was quite a large hotel in central Bristol. We had venues to pay for. We had caterers to pay for. We had a band and party and beer, AV equipment as well. We had videographers coming along doing things. We had microphones, PA equipment rented. And so this was a major hassle. Suddenly we could no longer pay for the event. How could we pay for these things? We contacted PayPal and they said, yeah, we've ring-fenced your funds because we think there's something suspect going on. This money's coming from 30 different countries. We said, well, it's an international conference. It's run several years before in various different places. And they said, well, send us the receipts. I said, well, we can't because we didn't organise it. Anyway, long story short, PayPal set on £70,000 and wouldn't let us access it for 3 months. Not until after the event had actually finished. So we had to suddenly find, and we were a small company, £70,000 to cover that. Now that was because PayPal is a centralised system. PayPal have the ability to seize funds. They have the ability to censor transactions. They have the ability to choose who and who can't use their system. Right? Now that's in some ways fair enough. It's their system. They built it. But in our case, it was a major hassle. We were taking payment. Suddenly our money was now frozen and held. There's nothing we could do to get it back. We pleaded with PayPal. All we got was an autoresponder back and a automated email. We would get our money in 3 months' time. In the end, we had to get a loan from somewhere else in order to cover it for that time. Now, actually, David Schwartz, the CTO now of Ripple, actually had a very similar story as well. I think he was trying to something along the lines of pay for or buy a birthday present for his wife, and PayPal seized the transaction. The present didn't arrive. I don't know whether this is urban legend or not, but it was one of the things that possibly led to the creation of XRP, the XRP ledger, ultimately Ripple and everything we're dealing with now. So that's an example of a centralized system. I think it's very clear that that is centralized. There's one company there that can determine who can and who can't transact. Then we come to decentralized or more decentralized systems, cryptocurrency systems. And like I said, it's a sliding scale. And yes, Mr. Mrs. whoever, W. Boomans, XRP can be frozen too. Yes, and a little laughing emoji there. It's a joke. It's a bit of a joke now within the XRP community, people saying that XRP can be frozen. And actually, it's one of the slides, I don't even have the page up, but I will bring it up in a bit. We'll come on to that a little later with regards to that. It's a common misconception that a lot of people believe that stuff on the XRP ledger can be frozen. It can't be, at least not XRP can't. So what do we mean by decentralized, and what is it that people are actually talking about? So you'll see a lot of people say Bitcoin is decentralized, XRP is centralized. I personally don't agree with that viewpoint. I think that XRP is decentralized in any way that, in my mind, is important. And that's not absolutely, but in anything that makes it important for me, I believe that XRP is decentralized. And I would say Bitcoin is also decentralized. I would say that Bitcoin is moving towards being more centralized and Bitcoin is moving towards being more decentralized in general terms. Again, we'll talk about that in a bit as we go along. So what are we talking about with regards to centralization and decentralization? Going back to these points again, we're going to talk about, first of all, we'll talk about the network. That's probably the easiest one, I think, to talk about because we can talk about it in quite absolute terms, I think. So in terms of the network, what do we mean by decentralized? So there's a lot of people who are under the false knowledge, the false view that the XRP ledger itself is run by Ripple, the company. Now, I can understand why people may have come to this conclusion. There's a very prominent company called Ripple who employ all the developers for the XRP ledger. They're the main company that is or has been historically pushing it ahead. They employ people who are in the news the whole time, going and talking to various foreign governments and regulatory bodies and on shows and all sorts of things. So people know a lot about them, and a lot of people outside the XRP community believe that Ripple control the XRP ledger. They don't. The XRP ledger is run over a whole number of nodes. Having a look here, this is a network topology map here showing a number of the nodes here, and there's a whole list of nodes here. Each one of these lines is a server somewhere running the Ripple D software, the software that runs the XRP ledger. And it normally tells you how many there are at the top. I don't see that. Nodes, 814. So there's 814 nodes. And this is a number that's slowly been going up as well. I think it was 818. There we go. It was 700 and something last time I checked a few weeks ago, I think. So each one of these is running a copy of the software, and that software is checking the transactions on the ledger. So every time somebody submits a transaction to the ledger, so Alice wants to pay Bob, that transaction is broadcast, and every single one of these nodes sees that transaction and applies it to its copy of the ledger. So Alice pays Bob 10 XRP, then that transaction is applied to every one of these ledgers, 10 XRP. And every one of these ledgers checks to make sure that's a valid transaction. So every one of them has a copy of the full state of the ledger, knows how much is in each account, and will know whether Alice has enough XRP to pay Bob. If Alice has 0 in her account, then she can't pay Bob 10 XRP. And so in that case, every node will check that and will not apply that transaction if that is false. So then within this subset of 800 nodes, there are a few nodes on here, well, there's about 200 of them, I believe, that that publish their validations. So what this is within the XRP ledger, I talked a little bit about this on previous shows, the XRP ledger uses a protocol called consensus to agree on the order of transactions. The reason this is important is to prevent what's called the double spend problem. So the double spend problem is Alice tries to pay 10 XRP to Bob and also pay 10 XRP to Charlie at the same time. And if Alice only has 10 XRP in her account, she can only pay that 10 XRP once. And if those two transactions get submitted to two different servers on other sides of the planet, they need to be able to come to an agreement on which transaction was first so that they know the second transaction can't possibly go ahead because Alice has spent all her money. Now, proof of work blockchains like Bitcoin do things in a different way. They have a system called miners. I've covered this a little bit and I'll go into it a bit further in another episode. But a very, very simple, simplistic way, don't shoot me for this, this is a gross simplification, but a simplistic way of thinking about miners is that you have effectively a lottery and one of the servers wins a lottery and chooses the transactions for the next 10 minutes. There's then another lottery, another server takes over for 10 minutes, and that server is the one that says who gets to which transaction goes first, and that's how they agree on the ordering. Whereas with the XRP ledger, everybody agrees collaboratively on them. Now, a lot of people think that XRP and the XRP ledger is centralized because they are under the misapprehension that Ripple control all of the validator nodes, and that because of that they can determine which transactions will go through and that they could possibly block a transaction. Well, that's not true. Here's another view of the the XRP ledger and the nodes. As you can see, they're spread fairly well across the globe. Be good to have some more in sort of North Africa and in Russia, but it's a good it's a good spread around the world. And the reason why that's good is because you don't want the control of the network to all be within one legal or political jurisdiction. You don't want to have all of your nodes be within one country and that one country then have a civil war or some government mandate that prevents them from operating, because that would be detrimental. So as you can see, the XRP ledger is spread out fairly well across the globe. So why do people think that the XRP or Ripple can censor transactions or seize transactions? Like I said, a lot of them believe that Ripple control all of the validators. Now, in order to come to consensus on the number of transactions or the order in which transactions happen, you need to have 80% agreement. And if we go, I think I've got somewhere here. No, that's Lightning Network. Here we go. Here is a tool here, and by a user called Synapple. I'm sorry, I don't know your real name. But this is a tool here that shows the list of validators that have been published by Ripple. So the way the XRP ledger works is each node chooses who they want to believe for the validation. In a previous talk, I think the first talk, I talked a bit and I did this analogy about a courtroom and witnesses. If you have a jury of, say, or 100 witnesses to a crime, now you can go and interview, say, 10 out of those 100 witnesses, and if 9 say that Bob killed Charlie in the living room with a dagger, you can probably think that that's going to be right. And if you pick a random 10 out of that 100, then none of them know who's going to be asked, and so collusion is very difficult, right? You'd have to get all of them to collude, which is actually very difficult. So this is a list of the validators that are published by Ripple. Now, anybody can choose a validator list, what's called the UNL, the unique node list, but Ripple do publish one for convenience, and most people follow this. Now, on this list, there are 12 validators run by Ripple out of 20. So that means Ripple have 60% dominance. Now, this has recently been dropping their dominance level. So recently they've started to add community validators in. So originally it was all Ripple ones. Then we started getting some for some partners that have run validators for a long time. So WorldLink, AT Tokyo, Talindus, Flagship Solutions. Bitso and Bahnhof. Bahnhof's a ISP in Sweden. Bitso's a exchange, I think, in Brazil, perhaps. Anyway, recently we've had Rabbit Kit Club. People might know Rabbit from Twitter, and the validator from the Xrp Tipbot, Vitsa Vienna, who's on the chat here possibly now still. Thank you very much, Vitsa. And Rabbit for running your validators. So these are random people. So Vitsa's a developer from the Netherlands that has got no connection with Ripple other than picking up the code and started to develop the XRP Tipbot, which is fantastic. And Rabbit, he wrote a blog post, which was the first blog post I read about the XRP ledger just over a year ago, and he was running a validator, and that's what got me kind of interested in doing it. And he's a random guy who lives in Detroit area, near Detroit in the US, and runs a validator that's now on this list. So Ripple do not have the 80% dominance. But even so, even if they did have, all of these nodes that are on the network are voluntarily choosing to listen to the list published by Ripple. So the power that Ripple have, in what little power they do have, and I'll cover that in a little bit, but what power they do have is only by virtue of people granting them power. So you could say that, for instance, somebody can stand up on a crate in the middle of a shopping mall and start, talking about something. Well, they only have as much power as people who stop and listen to them. If nobody stops and listens to them, they don't have any power. Those people can choose to walk somewhere else and listen to somebody else if they don't like what's going on. And that's very much what happens with the XRP ledger, or what could happen with the XRP ledger. If for any reason people decided that Ripple were no longer being a good steward within the community, then or a good player within the community, then they could choose to no longer listen to Ripple's validators. And that's the power that the community have. So just looking at the chat here, Tom, trust is agreement. So agreement here, this agreement column, if that's what you're referring to, is how many times that validator has agreed with the rest of the validators. And as you can see, in most cases, it's 99.99% of the time that they've come to agreement. And remember, all they are trying to agree on is the order in which transactions happen. It doesn't really matter whether Alice's payment to Bob or to Charlie comes first, because Alice is the one that is being nefarious by making that payment twice. So the rest of the network doesn't really care whether it's Bob or Charlie that gets paid first, only that one of them gets paid. So the agreement, all they're coming to agreement with is what order the transactions occur in. They agree on what order the transactions are, but they don't care what that order is, if that makes sense. So all they have to do is agree that, a certain number of them happened and in that particular order. But it doesn't matter which order it is. It could be the complete opposite order, just as long as they agree on it. Because the first transactions that go through are the valid ones. If there's a double spend, if somebody tries to spend their money twice, then the latter transaction that happens that does that will be deemed invalid. So that's hopefully answering your agreement there. Tom, is the node the same as a validator? So nodes on the network, there are those 814 nodes on the network. Of that 814, a subset are called validators, 818. A subset are called validators, and that is a subset that publish their validations. So of that 818, I think there's about 200 that publish their validations. And again, people have to configure their servers to listen to particular servers for the validations. So unless somebody is listening to the server, then it doesn't have any power. So for instance, somebody said, well, if there's a consensus that needs to be agreed, it needs to be 80% consensus. What is stopping me from starting up 1,000 servers, 10,000 servers? Then surely I would have the majority and I could come to whatever consensus I wanted and I would win. Well, you wouldn't, because nobody would be listening to you. The reason nobody will be listening to you is they don't know who you are. So generally nodes are configured to trust other servers that they know. So the reason why, for example, we have Rabbit and Vitsa's validators on Ripple's list is because they have shown themselves over time to be good players in the community, and they run the servers in accordance with sort of best practice, and we know that they have a vested interest in XRP running. None of the validators or node operators are paid. In certain cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin, validators, well, what are called miners in Bitcoin, are paid. That's what miners do. That's why there's these big mining farms and people consuming vast amounts of electricity, because they're actually paid for it. And it's kind of a game to effectively be paid more than you're paying out in electricity. And hence why a lot of these mining pools are ending up in places with cheap electricity. So by hydroelectric power plants in Canada, or disused or disconnected coal-fired power stations in China, for example. So Darren's asking here, is it difficult to switch validators out of the list and put your own choice in from a technical perspective? No, it's not. The validators, so there's two ways in which you can choose your validators. One is you say, here is a URL with a list of validators, and Ripple publish this. You probably won't be able to see this here, but there's a URL, and Ripple have this list here. It's encoded, so you can't really see it, so it's not a particularly great slide to show. But that has this list here of validators. And you can choose that list, or you could choose another list published by somebody else. Or you could manually specify each one of these in your list. Now, the only criteria is that you have to have a certain amount of overlap with the rest of the validators on the network. So if you chose a completely separate pool of validators that nobody else was listening to, you would be on a separate network. Now, in Bitcoin terms, you could call that a fork of the network. If you have two separate ledgers and they have two separate sets of validators that have no overlap whatsoever, the extreme case, then they would be two separate networks. One would be XRP, one would be something else, whatever. It might still be internally called XRP, but they would be two separate ledgers with two separate sets of transactions on. Now, the reason that doesn't happen comes down to the economic side of things, in that people want the system to work. And so because people want the system to work, there's no incentive, there's no reason to not agree. Because the only thing you do by disagreeing is effectively harming yourself. So yes, technically it's easy to do from a technical perspective. So should we decide that there is a somebody on this list always has a very high disagreement rate, we could choose to evict them from the list, either manually on each node, or Ripple could do it from their validator list. So Owen asks, what's the use of a node if the validators do the work? So the other nodes still have a use. The other nodes are what clients can send transactions to. So if you have a Ripple wallet, say on your phone or on your computer, then when you say, I want to send a payment to Bob, then you have to send that to one of those 814 nodes on the network. And so any one of them. So I run a node, for instance, because I write trading bots that trade on the network, and they send a lot of transactions. So for reliability, I run my own node because I'm not then relying on somebody else's, and they could decide to shut it down, or if I overloaded it, they could deem that they don't want me to put such a load on their server. So, but also, like I said, every single node actually checks the validity of the transaction. So validators is slightly a misleading term, because the validators are only validating the order of the transactions, not necessarily the integrity of the transactions. So all the rest of those 600 will still check to see whether Alice actually has enough money to pay Bob, and if she doesn't, won't apply that transaction. So they are still a safety net, and they also keep a copy of the ledger, so that should the ledger disappear for whatever reason, it's effectively a backup of the ledger. So Darren's asking, figured it was, I feel like fraudsters make it seem like it's super difficult to switch out validators. No, it's not super difficult. It's not super difficult. The issue being, like I said, a lot of people think that Ripple have a lot of power. Now, by de facto, they do have a lot of power. I wouldn't say it's power. It's definitely not control. It might be influence, but I wouldn't say it's control. And they only have that because we give it to them. If every one of the nodes on the network decided to no longer use any one of Ripple's validators, then Ripple's validators are no longer part of the picture. Now, taking this a step further, I talked about some of the other areas about centralization. I talked about, for instance, code base. So the code, each one of those nodes is running software. So you can see here what version software it's running. RippleD 1.01 is the latest production one. You can see the red ones are certain older ones. The blue ones are ones in development. So, but everybody's running the software that was written originally by the creators of the Xrp ledger, and then maintained by Ripple. And that code is open source code. It's on a site called GitHub, which allows people to go in and see the code and go in there, and even they can even make changes. You can take a copy of this code. So although this code is under Ripple's control, you can actually take a copy of the code. And looking up here, I'll just zoom in a little bit. Fork 864. There are 864 copies of this code base that people have created. And so we can go down here and we can see all the different code bases that have been created. And I think if we go down on here, we'll probably see that I was looking for Jesper's code base. I don't see it there. I know that Jesper on the chat here, Jesper Wallen, has been working on porting this code to run on a different operating system called OpenBSD, which is similar to Linux but slightly different. Here's my copy here. So I've got a copy of the code. I forked it, and here we can see that there's a branch on here, I believe, master branch. But I've forked it and I can make changes here. Now I can release my own version from here. In fact, so as a lot of you will know, Ripple, for instance, they own about 60% of the Xrp tokens. The majority of that 60% are in cryptographic escrow. So they are stored on the ledger and nobody can touch them, not even Ripple themselves, until they come to the end of their escrow time. And there's a certain time period in which they will expire and become usable again. If enough of us decided to, we could disable the escrow finish functionality in the code base. And if enough of us decided to run this code base, then Ripple would no longer be able to get their tokens out of escrow. We could effectively remove 60% of the Xrp tokens from the ecosystem, completely. And that's something we have the power to do. In order to do that, we would need the majority of the network to be running that change. Now, that is a social problem, not a technical problem then. Now, the majority of people would probably agree that that is actually not a good idea, because Ripple are using that XRP for good. They are incentivizing a lot of projects. They're using it in Spring, Coil. They've been doing a lot of philanthropic work and donations. So they're using that XRP, what's often referred to as their XRP war chest, for good. But if for any reason we decided that actually we didn't want Ripple to have that 60%, we could remove it from them. We have that power to do that. But to do that, we would need agreement of the majority of the network. And this comes on to the fundamental point that with any decentralized system, the control, the power, is always with the economic majority, or the majority rather. So the reason for that being is it actually comes down to the very core of it, that in a decentralized system, there is no one person with any kind of secret source that can prevent anybody else from doing anything. I can do anything on the Xrp ledger that Ripple can do. Anything. There's nothing that they can do that I can't do. or any one of you could do. So on that basis, Ripple actually have the biggest to lose. If they decided to no longer be good players in the network and did something really bad and everybody decided they no longer trusted them, then there could be a revolt and the community could effectively remove that power along with that 60 billion tokens from them. So it's very much in Ripple's interest to be a good player. And this is what keeps them honest. If you see the talks from David Schwartz, he says, call us up on this stuff. We want to be good citizens, and we have a very big impetus to be good citizens, because if we don't, we could lose a lot here, and they could lose a lot more than me. I don't have 60 billion XRP, much as I'd love to. They would lose a lot more than me. It would hurt them a lot more. So this comes down to the core thing. In any decentralized network, regardless of how it's organized, any decentralized network, the power is with the majority, because there is no secret source held by any one entity. The phone network, for instance, the mobile phone network, the GSM network, I can't create my own handsets and run them on the GSM network, or suddenly set up my own cell tower or whatever, without the blessing of the phone network. The reason being is that they hold the passwords, the keys, the certifications, everything that they need in order to operate, and I don't have them. So on a technical level I couldn't, and on a legal level I couldn't either. Right? But there's nothing like that generally with cryptocurrencies, and especially decentralized cryptocurrencies. There's no secret source. So that is the main reason why when somebody says XRP or the XRP ledger is centralized, that is the main reason why I disagree with them on that. Because there's nothing there that can stop them. The situation I had with PayPal seizing my funds, that can't happen on XRP. That can't happen on the XRP ledger. So Darren asks, so if Ripple came out and said they needed to release more XRP from escrow to sell for a giant liquidity provider 1 month, only way they could do that if community voted yes. Well, not even, because it's not that the community would vote yes to release the escrow. The community would have to vote to change the rules by which the escrow operates. So it's not just releasing their escrow, but it's effectively rewriting the rules. So the ledger knows that there's a set of rules in the ledger, and the escrow can only be completed once a certain, in this case, time frame has passed. Now we would have to change the rules and say that actually we want to release it regardless of what the time frame is, and we would have to get enough people to agree to that, which realistically is just not going to happen, right? But it could do. World's coming to an end, we need that XRP, everybody says, wait a minute, let's do this, let's get together, then we could do that. Exactly the same with Bitcoin, Ethereum, all of those other ones. If you get together and agree to change the parameters of the network, you can change the network. So you've got Bitcoin Cash. Now, Bitcoin Cash forked off from Bitcoin because there was a disagreement on some fundamental parameters of the network. And they decided that they wanted to have a larger block size on Bitcoin Cash. The community couldn't agree, and so effectively it forked off, and the group that agreed one way went one way, and the group that agreed the other way went the other way. That's the power that you have in a decentralized system, to be able to do that. And you could do the same with XRP as well. So Tom asks, if the trust in Ripple is gone, the value of XRP would drop to 0. Okay, tricky question. So here we get onto economics, I guess, about decentralization. What is the impact that Ripple have in holding 60 billion XRP? If they hold 60%, so one of the things that some people say is, well, if they hold so much, they could flood it on the network and devalue it. Well, we've already talked about the escrow, so they can't. And the reason they put it in escrow was to address that concern. So they put the XRP, their XRP, in escrow to release it 1 billion per month. And they don't even spend that. They spend a fraction of that. I can't remember the exact figure, but they spent 10% of it last month, I think it was. And it goes back into another escrow that's in 50, 60 months' time, something like that, the end of the queue, and keeps going. So, but what impact could Ripple have if they disappeared or did something with their currency? Well, they could disappear, and we would have to work out what would cause that. So again, this comes back to stepping back. When somebody says centralized or decentralized, and they say, well, yes, Ripple could do this. Well, take a step back and think, why would Ripple do that? So we say the trust in Ripple is gone. So either Ripple do something bad, or they disappear off the face of the planet. Would they do something bad? Well, considering they're the largest shareholder, in a stakeholder in the ecosystem, and they've got 60 billion XRP, they're not really going to want to do something bad. You know, at the peak, the end of last year, start of January this year, they were the largest fintech company in the world. You know, their CEO was one of the largest or the highest paid people on the planet, right? Or not highest paid, had the greatest wealth on the planet. So, you know, why would they want to destroy that? You know, obviously that is worth something. They've spent 5-6 years so far building that up. Why would they want to destroy that? So the trust in Ripple, I doubt they would do anything malicious because they would destroy that. Also, remember, Ripple are an actual legal entity. They're a company. They have shareholders. Now, they did not fund their initial operation by the sale of XRP, as in some companies do with an ICO. Ripple didn't do that. They were funded by a number of venture capitalists. And you can look online and you can see that they were funded by, including people like Google, funded them. So they have a fiduciary legal duty to their shareholders. And if they suddenly did something that devalued all the XRP, they could be sued by their shareholders. And because we know who Ripple are, and because they actually have a legal presence, that can happen. So they are more accountable than, say, some large Bitcoin whale, anonymous Bitcoin whale that holds, a number of million Bitcoin that nobody knows who they are. They could do something you wouldn't know. So with XRP, yes, Ripple have a lot of power, but we know where they are. We know where they live. We can go knock on their door if something goes wrong there. Connection drop. Oh no. Well, Ripple, YouTube still think it's good, so I'm going to continue, but I'll keep going. Sounds 100%. Okay, good. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned, Ripple have the biggest to lose if they were to act maliciously. Then the other aspect is, well, what if they just suddenly disappeared? Well, yes, they could disappear, but it would be pretty difficult for them to just suddenly go bust, considering how many XRP they hold and the value of that. It'd be very difficult to suddenly go bust. And what about if something impacted them? So at the moment, there's a question about, would XRP be deemed a security in the US? And did Ripple get involved in selling an unlicensed security? There's a couple of lawsuits out available. My personal view is that it's not a security. As I said, they didn't fund their initial operations using XRP. There's a lot more to it than that. I'm not a lawyer. My view is that it doesn't fit the definition of a security. It has no obligation to, I hold XRP, that gives me no obligation other than the ability to spend XRP. So, or no privilege other than the ability to spend XRP. So I don't see how Ripple could suddenly disappear. And again, even if they did, the ledger would still continue. So yes, it would probably take a drop because you no longer have all of these people talking to banks around the world, but somebody else could take that up. Somebody else could continue that. Somebody could use it for another reason. So you've got people like Coil who are using XRP for micropayments, and soon you're going to have Coil and ILP, the Interledger protocol, built into your browser. It's already got some underpinnings already there. And so you'll be able to visit a website and pay directly. I'd be able to get paid directly from this streaming video. For every second you watch, I get 1,000th of an XRP or something, automatically. You don't have to do anything. Your browser just automatically knows. And that comes back with a whole different monetization model for the web, which so far, if you think, is all to do with advertising and selling personal data. How does Facebook make money? They sell you adverts, they sell your personal data, mine your personal data. Well, there's a growing concern with that, especially with political events worldwide and the misuse of data and things like GDPR coming in Europe that is causing a lot of crackdown on the use of data. Well, alternative monetization models could become very, very popular. So using XRP to actually do micropayments on the web would be a massive thing, possibly more so than cross-border payments even. So if Ripple suddenly disappeared, yeah, there would probably be a drop in the price, I would imagine, short term. But I think it would still be valuable and it would still go up. If they disappeared, what would happen to their XRP? If they suddenly vanished, would that suddenly mean that, if suddenly everybody who worked for Ripple and who knew the secret keys to Ripple's account suddenly vanished off the planet, then there's 60,000 XRP that suddenly, 60 billion XRP that suddenly disappeared out of the ecosystem. So does that mean the other 40 billion is now worth a lot more? Maybe. So that's a bit about that and the sort of economics side of things. So I've talked a lot about XRP. I actually wanted to talk a bit about some others as well, just to kind of compare. That's another fantastic view of the XRP payments going on right now. So this is not the ledger as such, but these are the payments and the accounts. It's really quite a lovely view, a living ledger that shows all the transactions going on. You can actually see each transaction and who they transact with, which is really quite cool. So this network here, this is the Lightning Network. So Bitcoin, which is often touted as being the most decentralized system because the way in which it works with miners means there's no one entity that is distributing the tokens. With XRP, all 100 billion were created when the ledger was first founded by the creators of the ledger, and of that 80 billion were given to Ripple, the company, to use. 20 billion were kept by the founders. With Bitcoin, they're distributed as time goes on via the process of mining. The idea is meant to be to give anybody a chance to get them. What's actually happened is it's become a case that you need a lot of electrical power to basically power the mining rigs, and you need it to be cheap. So that's favouring economies of scale. Hence why there is the majority of the mining power in Bitcoin held by 3 or 4 mining pools in China. And so that, you can look here, Bitcoin hash rate distribution, we should be able to see. So this is these are the pools here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and I think of those, BTC, Antpool, via BTC, I think possibly Slushpool, are all in China. And so the Chinese government, for instance, could, put some sanction in place that could affect that. Now, that's not to say these other pools wouldn't take over, and maybe they might fill the gap. And there's various economic reasons why this still would not be possible, because you have to maintain the attack for a certain amount of time, which costs a certain amount of money. All fair enough. But in Bitcoin, you only need to have 51% of collusion, effectively, in order to affect things. Remember, with XRP Ledger, it's 80%, so it's much harder. And not only that, as an end user, if we determine that, say, Antpool was being malicious, there's nothing I can do about it. There's nothing as a participant in the network I can do. I cannot stop Antpool having the control that they have. I can't do that. I can't decide to not listen to them, because the way that Bitcoin works is it's automatically distributed. The power is distributed in proportion to the mining power. And so Antpool will have their 13%, whether I like it or not. The entire community could decide that they don't want Antpool to have 13%. There is nothing they can do about it. The only thing they could do would be to try and set up more mining themselves in order to get a greater percentage and basically overpower Antpool. Now, which means that they would have to have more money to do so. And if, say, something happened in China and you needed to move the mining pool out, well, these things are literal physical warehouses full of equipment connected to power stations, right? That's not an easy thing to move. Even if you can physically move, the logistics of moving all of the equipment, you've also got to find somewhere that has cheap power. Otherwise, it's no longer economical to run. You're going to be losing money. Whereas the validators on the XRP ledger, they don't have this expensive mining process. And the mining process, this is the lottery I alluded to earlier. So I simplified it and called it a lottery. It's a series of computations that are done, and it's designed such that you have to do a certain number of these computations. And so, you know, you have to physically move this equipment to somewhere else and get another power deal in order for it to be economical. The XRP ledger doesn't have that. So if you want to move the servers, well, the servers are, you know, a single machine or a virtual machine even. They can be moved, you know, or you can reconfigure the network. As I said, you can choose to not listen to one validator and choose to listen to another one. If suddenly all the validators within, you know, Brazil, for example, for some reason are no longer deemed trustworthy, then you can decide no longer to trust validators in Brazil. You can't do that with Bitcoin. So Tom asked, but 51% would be a weapon of mass destruction. Yeah, it probably would be. It would be a pretty big thing. And like I said, it's a very expensive thing to do. But it's within the realm of state actors, I believe. You know, it's something that they could do. And also, not only that, they can actually effectively cause double spends to happen. So if they get 51% of the power, they have the ability to spend money twice, effectively create additional Bitcoin. Now, this has actually happened on some of the other proof-of-work blockchains. So Bitcoin Gold recently, and was it Verge, one of the other proof-of-work chains, had a similar thing in which, you know, several million tokens were fraudulently created because somebody managed to get 51% control. So, you know, if you manage to get 51% control on a proof-of-work system, you can do a lot more damage. Whereas on the XRP ledger, if you got 80%, all you could do would be to cause confusion. If you caused enough nodes to no longer agree, you would not reach consensus. You would not be able to determine which transactions came first, and the ledger would stop. It would just stop processing. Nobody would lose their money. No double spends would happen. Just everything would stop. Now, that might be detrimental economically as well, because, you know, somebody could have some short open or a contract open or some futures contract or something, and you know, could potentially game the market in that way. But it's a pretty big thing to do, and as I said, you can remedy it fairly easily as well. So what else have we got here? There's another question here that I think I just missed going up. Let me just see if I can scroll back slightly on one of the questions. Ripple is targeting Nostra accounts, Stuart XRP. What do you think they'll do with their existing funds they have in there? Okay, so this is, again, on the economic side of things. So Ripple's end goal for XRP is to replace an element of the correspondent banking system called Nostra and Vostra accounts. And that is to do with bank accounts having to basically keep in reserve funds in foreign bank accounts so that they can make transactions. And so that's money that's sat there. And it's globally is, I think, something like $4 quadrillion or something that's sat in Nostra Vostra accounts. I could have that number wrong, but I think it's a stupidly large number. And that could be released if Ripple managed to achieve their end goal of what they're trying to do with XRP. And if XRP took over, that could be released, and that could be a major economic advantage because that could be used for other things. So someone said here, Mangoe, Bitmain opening a facility in Texas. So yeah, this is another thing. So Bitmain is a company that create a lot of the Bitcoin mining hardware. And so I think over 50% of the hardware mining Bitcoin is run by one company, is produced by one company. Now, what if that company decided to put some backdoor in the system, and there was I think it was theoretical, it may have been actually discovered, vulnerability called ant bleed, which was a vulnerability in a miner called the ant miner, in which there was, you know, positioned this theory that they could have a remote stop and cause all the mining rigs running their hardware to suddenly stop. So they could suddenly stop 51% of the network, which would obviously give everybody else additional power. So that's a massive thing that they would have control over. They had. So Clara, just hot here. Did I miss the big reveal? I'm not sure what big reveal we're after here, but the answer is XRP's not centralized. That's maybe the punchline here that we're working towards. But yeah, I'm trying to sort of explore it a bit with people to give them a bit more of a understanding as to why people would say centralized or decentralized, and what factors influence that. Don't worry, Sid. Missed a lot of the stream. It is recorded, so you can watch it and see. And so Clara says, I thought Cobalt would stop the stops to slow down. Okay, yes. So the XRP ledger has this consensus protocol as to how they come to agreement on which nodes, which order the transactions are in. And that's called the Xrp Consensus Algorithm, I think. Very imaginative titled. There's a new algorithm they've developed, or designed rather, called Cobalt, that is going to be hopefully in development some point. I don't think development has actually started on it. Maybe it might happen next year, but theoretically Cobalt has been shown, mathematically, to have what's called better liveness, and so it's much harder to stop the network dead. If there's a disagreement, I believe it still continues. It goes a bit slower, but it still continues. So it's got better resilience should that happen. Again, this is a pretty far off eventuality that somebody could do this in the first place. But Cobalt has a number of advantages. One is that ledgers would close every 1 second rather than 3 seconds. Now, 3 seconds is pretty fast. Bitcoin is 10 minutes. 3 seconds is pretty fast. 3 seconds is fast enough for you to pay at a checkout in a shop, but it could get down to 1 second, and it has some better liveness properties, which would be good. So governance, yes, Tom. What about governance? So I'm going to switch to there. Take a sip of my wine because I'm losing my voice. So governance is probably one of the 4 areas I've talked least about so far. So how is a cryptocurrency governed? Is there an aspect of centralization or decentralization about governance? So who makes the decisions as to what happens? As I said, the code base is open source, so anybody can create their own copy of the ledger and run it how they want. They can fork it if they want, and so anybody can develop it and do what they want. But yes, there's probably still a level of momentum that Ripple have in terms of deciding what features are going to happen, because they're paying the majority of the developers. So they are paying the developers that are developing stuff. They're also choosing which trade shows to go to and all that kind of thing, mainly because they've got the money, right? They hold the money. They're calling the shots in that regard. But like I said, there's nothing stopping anybody else from doing it as well. If I decided that I wanted to use XRP in a particular scenario, there's nothing stopping me doing that. And I could go to a trade show and promote that, for example. So I could determine that. And if enough people thought that was a good idea, then that can happen. Again, all these things are possible if you get enough people behind it. And that's really where the power is. So some people say Ripple have a kind of de facto power on the basis of, they are, everybody trusts them, right? If I came up with a feature and said, hey, I've got this great feature, people might say, yeah, so what, Matt? We don't care. If David Schwartz came out with a feature, they'd probably say, hey, that's good. And the reason being is that they know him, they've seen him, they trust him more than me, right? They would trust him a lot more than some other random person on the internet that comes up with his feature. But that's actually a social problem, not a technical one. And that is because he has proven himself to be trustworthy. I might be that trustworthy in 5 years' time in developing something too. Who knows? So could somebody else. People like Vitsa Vind have done fantastic job on developing stuff on the XRP ledger, and is now, very well trusted. And hence, as a result, his validator is now being published in Ripple's unique node list. That's fantastic. And that's because he's proven himself to be trustworthy. But that, again, is a social issue, not a technical issue. People say about governance, well, Lightning network on Bitcoin is mainly being governed by a small group of companies. And there's one company called Blockstream that are pushing it quite heavily. And if we go back to, where is it here, the Lightning Network, on a technical level, one of the things I didn't cover about is in the Lightning Network, you can see there's a lot of centralization starting to happen. So people say that the Bitcoin, that the Lightning Network is decentralized. The way it's actually architected, it's very slow to open a channel to pay somebody, but you can pay somebody via a third party. If you've got a channel to, so Alice wants to pay Charlie, Alice has to open a channel to Charlie, which could take an hour while the transaction happens, or at least 10 minutes for the transaction to happen on the main blockchain. But if Alice already has a channel open to Bob, and Bob has a channel open to Charlie, then the payment can hop from one to another. But that then leads itself to the creation of these kind of centralized hubs in which have a lot of liquidity for people to use, because you're not going to want to stand in your coffee shop. And if you go to a brand new coffee shop, you're not going to want to wait 10 minutes or an hour to open a new Lightning channel to make a payment to them. You're going to use a channel that you already have open to somewhere else. And so that's going to lead to this centralization. And that's why I say that I think Bitcoin is actually heading towards more centralization, both with things like the Lightning Network and with things like the centralization around economies of scale and power, sort of making things more centralized. Whereas with the XRP ledger, you don't have that economy of scale, you don't have that power draw. Validators are not financially rewarded in the XRP ledger, so they're running it from their own benefit rather than trying to rent seek on the network or game the system or profit from the network as a whole. So let's go on the comments. Darren, let's just scroll past. Need to scroll back. Do you see a similar situation with certain entity ever solely owning a majority of the node's validators, same as how certain entities are slowly owning a majority of the mining pools? No, I don't, because the reason that's happening in Bitcoin is because there's the economics there. You can make vast amounts of money if you can run a profitable mining pool. And the amount of money you make is directly proportional to the scale of it. So find the cheapest place, the biggest warehouse, get the cheapest equipment, and pile it in there and keep piling it in there. Take the money out, buy more, pile it in there. That's why it's becoming centralized. With the XRP ledger, there's no incentive, financial incentive, for running a validator node. So that doesn't happen. So sorry, I'm going to butcher your name, Miyogi. I'm curious as to what projects are in the works relating to the Spring Initiative. Nothing has been mentioned on that since it was announced. I don't know either. I think Coil came out of the Spring Initiative as part of it, but I don't know anything else. Ripple have their conference Swell that's coming up, that's mainly aimed towards banks. That's coming up in a few months' time. I imagine maybe more announcements around that. Stuart XRP asks, what's Xpool? Again, a lot of speculation. I don't think there's anything definitive. A lot of speculation is that Xpool is a liquidity provider on the XRP ledger that might allow banks to effectively rent XRP, lease XRP to use, something along those lines. So Tom's saying, so social trust XRP versus cryptographic trust Bitcoin. Yes, exactly. Social trust versus cryptographic. Now, some people argue that cryptographic trust is stronger because it can't be broken. That's great. But in the case of Bitcoin, you're seeing, for example, that it is leading to effects that I think are detrimental to the network in terms of the centralization, and there's no way to reverse that. Whereas with XRP, it is social trust, but it's entirely up to you who you trust. So if you decide you don't trust somebody, you don't have to trust them. So Xpool is a trademark that Ripple owns but is not yet publicized. Yes, exactly. That's where most people saw it about a year or so ago. I think they registered a trademark, and yeah, there's a lot of speculation, but what exactly it is, I'm not sure. Alice Jesper says, sure, no benefits except that all the cool people run a validator. Yeah, exactly. Lots of cool people run validators, and Jesper is doing a fantastic job, like I mentioned, about trying to get the RippleD running on OpenBSD, which is great because it's another operating system, and it's quite good to have diversity within a community in that regards. If there's a vulnerability that affects, say, Linux, then having another operating system that might not be vulnerable to that same one is good. I personally like OpenBSD more than Linux myself, so I'm very interested in that effort. Anyway, we've gone over an hour now, so hopefully I'm going to wrap it up now. Hopefully we've talked a bit about centralization and decentralization here. I had some more things that I haven't actually covered. Very, very briefly going through Stellar, whose dashboard is no longer loading. Stellar, on a technical basis, very similar to Xrp, has the same notion of nodes and validators on there. Their validators run by a number of different companies as well. Stellar own about 80%, 82%, something like that, of the XLM in existence, and in my mind not as open as Ripple in terms of what they're doing with it. They don't have the escrow facilities. They are supposedly a 501c3 registered not-for-profit in the US, although they've never actually filed their paperwork, which could be seen as fraudulent. But yeah, similar kind of thing. EOS, new one that's come out. EOS has these block producers. They're actually paid. They're paid a big chunk of money, I think, tens of thousands of dollars to run. And whilst in theory this is all decentralized, there was an issue in which there was this dispute, something went wrong, and they basically got everybody on a phone call and said, well, here's how we're going to approach it. Some people would say if you can get everybody on a phone call and make a change, that it must be centralized. I wouldn't go that far. Again, this goes down to the social side of things. If they didn't want to, then they wouldn't. They're obviously doing it for the benefit of the network, or possibly their tens of thousands of dollars, perhaps. If you're slightly more cynical. Digibyte is another one. Very, again, I was looking for a node list. I haven't got it here, but there's thousands, I think tens of thousands of nodes running on the Digibyte network. It's a proof of work system, a bit like Bitcoin. It uses 5 different hashing algorithms, which supposedly means it's less vulnerable to the 51% attack, although Verge uses that same technique, and Verge was susceptible to 51% attack because one of those 5 was susceptible, so it only meant that 1 out of 5 had to be have a 51% attack against it. I'm not sure the same thing's applicable to Digibyte, but could well be. Yeah, so I think that's really what I wanted to cover. Hopefully that gives you some idea about decentralization, centralization. Okay, one more question here. Do you think regulators, SEC for instance, actually understand what you have said about decentralization and XRP? Oh, good question, Darren. No idea. Most lawmakers seem to have very little idea about any technology they are passing laws on as a general rule, unfortunately, which is a problem. What do they see in these things? Do they understand about the decentralization? Yes, maybe. Ripple are obviously talking to them a lot. There's a whole, this is a whole can of worms in that, for example, in 2014, FinCEN, which is the US sort of department that deals with financial conduct and that with these companies, fined Ripple for acting for running an unlicensed money bureau. So they didn't have the license to sell XRP to the public. So they were fined for that and slapped with a certain number of conditions, like they can't create an XRP wallet or sell to the public, which is why Ripple don't. That's why there isn't a Ripple wallet now. They used to have a very nice one, but it's no longer available because they were fined by the US government. So there's one argument that says, well, if the US government have fined them for not having the license to sell money, then surely they can't also come after them for selling an unlicensed security, because something cannot be a currency and a security at the same time. It can either be one or the other. Now, the SEC is different to FinCEN. They have different jurisdictions. One could still contradict the other. I'm no expert in the US law. A lot of this will come down to exactly how things are interpreted in the courts. So it could come down to one judge and whether what they've read. Maybe if one of these judges has seen this video, maybe they'll have a better understanding. That'd be great. I'd love that if that to be the case. I'm a little more cynical than that, though. Anyway, thank you very much. Well over time now, so I'm going to wrap it up. Any more questions, put them in the comments on the YouTube. Thank you ever so much. Please like the video. I'm a YouTuber now, so I've got to beg for you to like the video and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. There is actually a good reason for it. If I get enough subscriptions, I can actually change the URL to something more meaningful, which I can't do at the moment. So please go ahead and subscribe. That'd be very helpful. And yes, thank you very much. And I'll see you same time next week. And I'll have to decide what the next topic's going to be about. But keep an eye. You can find me on Twitter @Hammertoe, or just keep an eye on this YouTube channel. Thank you very much then. Good night.